2 years ago, the idea that we'd be studying what gets flushed down Ontario toilets for signs of disease would have been met with blank stares from most people. But here we are. With us now for a closer look at what those indicators are currently showing, and we'll introduce our guests, as is our custom, from furthest away to closest to our studio, starting in Sudbury, Ontario, with Gustavo Ibazeta, bioinformatics and genomics researcher at the Health Sciences North Research Institute and an adjunct professor at Laurentian University. In the Alta Vista area of the nation's capital, Robert De La Tolla, professor of environmental engineering at the University of Ottawa and research advisor with the COVID-19 Wastewater Coalition. And in the west end of the provincial capital, Claire J. Oswald, associate professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at Ryerson University and the academic director of the Urban Water Research Centre. Great to have all of you aboard for our discussion tonight. And just in the interests of full disclosure, I guess I should mention that my wife is a board member of Health Sciences North, which is distinct from, but has a relationship with, the Health Sciences North Research Institute, of which Gustavo is a member. So we put that on the record in the interest of transparency for everybody to know. And with that, let's get to this. Robert, start us off. What does it mean to track COVID-19 through wastewater?
Well, Steve, so the virus of those individuals that are infected can be shed. So that could be shed through saliva, through sputum, fecally shed. So it ends up into the premise piping of our household. So it ends up into those pipes. Those pipes flow into the wastewater infrastructure of a city. So those underground sewers, so everything we don't really see or pay attention to. And we have these underground sewer networks that flow all of that wastewater traditionally to a wastewater treatment plant. And what we're able to do is, since this virus has been shed, we're able to go to that wastewater, collect the sample, and test that sample for the genetic material of the virus. And by doing that, we can measure the concentration. And we could track whether the virus is going up, or that concentration is going up, that concentration is plateauing, or that concentration is going down.
Claire, I don't want to get too much in the weeds here, but I think we have to in order to understand how this works. So, okay, it ends up at our water treatment facilities, all that stuff. How does it end up in a lab then for you folks to study?
Yeah, so the samples that we get from the wastewater treatment plants, most of those plants have to do compliance sampling anyway. So they're collecting samples daily. And so we can piggyback on that compliance sampling, and the municipality will provide us with samples. We also have sites, like Dr. De La Tolla said, that are up in the sewer network itself. And we go out and we collect those samples. So we have pumps up at the surface, and we suck sewage out of the sewers, put it in bottles, put it on ice. We take it back to the lab where the analysis occurs.
Okay, I think you may have just touched on what I wanted to follow up with, but you're talking little tiny test tubes of samples? You're talking massive tanks of samples, or what are we talking here?
Yeah, usually we're collecting anywhere from 1 to maybe 3 liters of sewage. So it's quite a bit of sewage that ends up coming back to the lab. And we don't use all of it for the analysis. A lot of people use just the solid material that's in the sample. Okay, Gustavo, again, another sort of icky question here, but how does COVID-19 end up in our feces?
Well, we have receptors, specific receptors that they're distributed in our body, but they are particularly accumulating in our digestive tract. And the virus, they use these receptors to get inside of our body. And once they are in our digestive tract, they produce the infection of the cells. The process of dying the cells, they produce diarrhea, they produce all kind gastrointestinal problems, and when they think is delivered to our wastewater, we end up collecting that, and the virus goes with all these secretion.
This is another reminder that this is a very messy business, right?
Yes.
Yes, it is. All right, Claire, when people say, and you hear this from time to time, wastewater signals are up, I sometimes hear that on the radio. What does that mean? Mm-hmm.
Right. So, we have all of these labs, a lot of which are university labs across the province, who are generating data on the levels of SARS-CoV-2 genetic material that's in the wastewater. All of that data gets reported to the province, to public health units, to facility managers so they can make decisions. If the data is of a sufficient frequency, so maybe samples collected 3 to 7 days per week, then you can actually use that for a trend analysis. And the province is doing that, many public health units are doing that. And what that means is they're looking for sudden changes in the level of genetic material that they are finding in the wastewater. And if they see a sudden change, then the subsequent data, they can look to see if it's trending upwards, downwards, or if it's kind of flat. And if we see more than a 10% increase in the level per day, then we say that that's an increasing trend, and that's what we mean by the signal is up.
Well, let's do a real-life example of this right now. And Robert, we're going to put a chart up here. And for those people who are listening to us on a podcast and can't see this chart, which basically looks like a tidal wave, maybe you could take us through the COVID-19 wastewater signals in Ontario, what these lines mean, what the dotted line at the end mean. Just take us through it, if you would, and explain what we're looking at.
Sure, Steve. So what we're seeing on the chart is you have two axes. So the vertical axis on the left-hand side is this concentration of that genetic material that we've been seeing. So just like Claire was saying, as it goes up or it goes down, and we could see the shape of that curve. And on the horizontal axis is time. And so watching this longitudinally across time, you see this huge wave, in December and January, coming down at the end of February and March. And now this is the concerning part, is you see that wave seem to be starting again. So you see this uptick, this increase in concentration, again, measuring that genetic material within the wastewater. And that wave is going upwards in a direction that's telling us, well, that isn't really good news for the province. It means that there is more material within our wastewaters. And if you look at that graph, there's also 6 regional graphs, Steve, that you could divide that graph into. So that graph's for the whole province. You could take that and you could find the 6 regional graphs on the Science Table website, the Ontario Science Table website. And you'll see that when you look at the 6 regions, so northern, eastern, GTA regions, you will see in all of the regions, unfortunately, it repeats that trend of this upward trend of the signal of COVID-19 in wastewater at the moment.
Well, we have a guy from Northern Ontario here, so let's do that. Gustavo, we don't have a graph of Northern Ontario. We can do better. We have you. So you tell us, what does your graph look like in Northern Ontario right now?
Well, our graph in the science table looks exactly the same, going up at this moment. I'm sampling a total of 6 places here in Northern Ontario. Of these 6 places, 3, they are definitely going up. 2, they are stable but up. They were stable where they were before, but that was considered up or high, sorry. And 1 that is Musoni, that is the farther that we are sampling at this moment, that they are relatively low. I think in average, we can say that all these groups, it will be the representation that we see in these graphics that basically going up.
So the wastewater that you're noticing right now, the amount of SARS-CoV-2 in the wastewater is a bit like the canary in the coal mine. You can anticipate that things are going to get worse. Is that right?
Yes. Basically indicating, that we will have more probably hospitalizations in the next few days. We'll see how our population react to this level of virus that is we'll find it in the wastewater.
Now, Northern Ontario, of course, Gustavo, is huge. You happen to be in Sudbury, but would the situation in Sudbury be the same as, for example, Timmins or Thunder Bay, which are, of course, very far apart, but all part of the north?
Yeah, it's something very interesting at this moment is that before I was saying that we are behind 2 to 3 weeks of what's happening in the south. Now we're having exactly the same curve that we have, like you show it, exactly the same curve that is for everybody, and exactly the same curve that we can observe in the GTA, just an increase. In the case of Susan Marie or North Bay, we're sharing more and more the same kind of signature. And the area of Porcupine, it's always a little bit, few days behind, but now we start to behaving more or less like everybody. I think we are having more transient population moving possibly between one place to other. And without restrictions, that's more feasible to have transmission.
Very interesting. All right, Claire, if I were to ask you what your map in the Greater Toronto Area looks like compared to the map of the entire province that we just saw, the graph rather, what would we see in the Toronto graph?
Right, so the Ontario Science Table does have a chart for the GTA, and so this includes the City of Toronto, but also municipalities around the outskirts of Toronto. And if you compare that to the other regions, I think some of the other regions, like out east, where Dr. Delatola is, that sudden change to an increasing trend happened a little bit before we saw it for the GTA, but now the GTA is also upticking. I will say, though, that in the City of Toronto, it wasn't until mid last week that we saw the viral levels start to go up in wastewater. The 4 plants that are being monitored in the City of Toronto proper, they actually had sort of a low, steady signal, but I think they're starting to head upwards as of last week.
Okay, Robert, you're in Eastern Ontario. What would your graph look like there?
Yeah, the graph over here in Eastern Ontario is going up sharply. So it's been going up at a high rate, the same kind of rate that we saw when we had the initial Omicron wave between, December and January. And it's been steadily going up every day, unfortunately. So the region is not looking the best. There might be some good news. We have some latest data points in some of the areas here in Eastern Ontario that are showing that we might be plateauing or cresting, but there's only a couple of points, but there's been a steep rise here for about 2 weeks.
All right, let me ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to bring the graph up again. This is the province-wide graph, and I want to draw everybody's attention to the right end of the graph, so right after where March becomes April, and we see the dotted line, the broken line, starting to go up towards the heavens again. Robert, my question is, how do we know that people armed with the information that we seem to be having to deal with another outbreak don't suddenly, start wearing masks a lot more, start being a lot more careful about things, and rather than having that line just continue up, maybe it flattens and starts to go down? How do we know that?
Well, that's the hope, Steve. Like that, that's, I think, and what's interesting is you're bringing up a really great point. So as we've been watching wastewater signal throughout the last 2 years, and whether restrictions are being announced that they're going to be applied or eased within different communities, we've observed that even prior to the date where the mandate was either removed or applied, you've seen the trend in wastewater respond. And I think it's exactly what you're talking about. There's a human response and a human behavior. You start hearing about the mandates, you start hearing about what's to come, and people respond early. So I think that's one of the benefits of wastewater data at this point, is that it's being seen by people around the province. And as an educational tool, we can make those decisions. So looking at this graph, personally, I see this graph all the time, so I wear my mask. Other people who see it might make other sort of inferences or decisions, but definitely there's a response to seeing the data in real time. And we hope that response, as you said, in this case, might lead to a plateau as opposed to that dotted line going up.
So will you be able to say definitively now that we are in a 6th wave of COVID-19 as we speak?
Well, if you look at the wastewater data, which we've looked at, it's definitely pointing to that. If you look at the percent positivity around the province, you're in the high teens. So that's pointing to it. If you look at the reproduction, the effective reproduction number around the province and around the PHUs, they're above, many of the PHUs are above 1. Across the province, we're above 1. All of these numbers, plus that slow uptick we're starting to see in hospitalizations, I think are indicative of a 6th wave.
Okay, PHUs, public health units, just we're an acronym-free zone here. All right, let's move on. Gustavo, can wastewater signals, let me set up this question this way. We know that with testing being the way it is today, it's not as, say, comprehensive as it once was during the course of the past 2 years. And as a result, when the province every day puts out a number saying, here's how many positive test cases we had, it's not as useful a number as it used to be because there's just so much less testing going on. Question, can wastewater signals tell us how many cases exist in one region in a way that testing, with PCRs or antigens can't tell us anymore?
Well, people, they are working very hard to produce models that will be gave us precisely that number. Peter Juni was one of the researchers that was working, and still many people that they are working very hard to produce models that will produce those numbers. I think we are in early stages to be have results in this direction, but I think we can say that eventually we will arrive and have something that is validated, and we will have this possible correlation.
Any idea when that might be able to happen?
I'm not working directly with that, but I think we are very close. We have already some results that we are very positive, but they're still in the process of validation of all these models.
All right, Claire, we live in a huge province. And obviously, if you just check the wastewater in Toronto, that's not going to tell you anything about Eastern or Southwestern or Central or Northern Ontario. So my question for you is, how many different water systems do you have to get samples from in order to have a good sense about what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, we only have information for the areas that are being sampled. So mainly those are areas that are on a sewer network and are draining to a wastewater treatment plant. So areas where people are on septic systems, if it's not being sampled, we don't have data for those areas. There are also some communities that make use of sewage lagoons. So it's only if those are being sampled.
So there would
that
be
we're
big,
going to get information.
Right. So there's presumably big chunks of rural Ontario where we just don't know anything right now.
Yeah, right now through the provincial initiative, there are about 170 locations being sampled, and that's, I think, just over 75% of the population of the province that is being sampled through this initiative.
Okay, well, that's not bad. But having said that, Gustavo, can you draw some inferences, or can you make some useful speculation about those who are on septic systems and therefore not caught by this testing about the prevalence of COVID-19 in their lives?
Well, one thing that we need to pay attention is that the people, they are not living in only one place inside of the city. They are moving inside of the city, and they can go to another places where maybe they are connected with our systems. We have a high number of people that they have septic tanks, and those people, they are not being evaluated, of course. But if these people go to places where they work and they can have access to facilities there, we'll be able to work. I think in all the sites that we have, we probably cover between 30 to 40, in some cases even 50% of the total population. And for our data that we have at this moment, comparing with the samples, with the clinical samples that were making sense before they were overwhelmed by Omicron, we were following very close. So we have confidence that we can have a close number that will reflect what is happening in the society.
Gotcha. Robert, let me ask you again about those PHUs, those public health units that you just referenced, and that is, how forthcoming with data have they been, or do they tend to be, in order to let you folks do the work that you do?
Yeah, so, this program started officially in January 15, 2021. So we've been doing this for quite a bit of time, and those of us have started quite a ways before that, right when the pandemic started. So we've had these interactions with public health units throughout. And, Steve, it's been really a spectrum. There's been some public health units that have been extremely supportive of this and progressive and have looked at the data and said, we're going to use it for what it's worth and just use it as a complementary tool to all the other information we've had. While other public health units, and understandably so, have looked at the data and said, well, there's no real provincial guidelines, there's no real kind of script for us to follow in terms of how to really interpret this data. And that's completely understandable. So you see a spectrum across the province, and possibly at this point, we alluded to this and talked about it, without the real kind of same critical mass of clinical data that we're able to see. I think the wastewater now is being more and more positioned as an important metric for us to really understand what's happening in our communities.
Claire, let me ask you about that. Robert says it's understandable that some public health units want to sort of be stingy with that information, but do you think it's understandable that they're not as open as they perhaps could be or should be?
I think that, wastewater surveillance data is it's tricky data to work with. It can be variable from day to day, and that's just, I think, the nature of how the samples are collected in the analyses. And I think that, like Dr. Della Tolla alluded to, like very close relationships and communications between the research teams that are doing the analysis and the public health units is critical for interpreting the data and to see through some of that variability.
Well,
So I can understand if those relationships don't get formed early on, then there could maybe be some trouble, fully using the data for a specific public health unit. But in our experience in the city of Toronto, we've had like an excellent relationship with Toronto Public Health, and we really work with them as a cohesive unit to interpret the data that our lab is putting out.
why do you think they've chosen to be particularly forthcoming when others have not been?
I think that they see the value in the data. They see the value of it as a complementary tool. In the city of Toronto in particular, and the data that's come out of our lab, we sample a lot of facilities as well, such as long-term care homes and homeless shelters. And I know that they've found that data very valuable. We've been able to catch outbreaks just before the clinical testing did. So, the value at that scale became very clear to the public health unit early on.
Gustavo, let me follow up with you in this regard. More and more businesses across Ontario are now opening up, of course, and I wonder whether you are concerned that those businesses that do reopen more, with the potential for more information coming from them, will that somehow skew the data across the province? What's your view on that?
Well, you remember that this is a statistical problem at the end. I think we can modify our parameters in order to take in account this new situation.
And Claire, what are there other sort of tricky things that you've got to be watching for as we sort of reopen the province more and more day by day?
Well, I think that maybe what your question alludes to is the fact that people are becoming more and more mobile, and their contribution to the wastewater samples that we're collecting may be coming from different places. And so that might be something that we need to take into consideration if we're trying to assign a certain level or trend to a specific area. And there is mobility data that you can use to understand how mobile a certain population that you're sampling is, and whether or not there's potential that they're contributing to the sample outside of their home area.
Got it. Robert, is it expensive to do this?
When you're comparing the cost associated with wastewater surveillance versus, clinically testing like we did throughout the pandemic, a large number of people in a population base, it's really, really not. I think that's one of the benefits of wastewater surveillance. And an example is Ottawa's 1 million people. Throughout the pandemic, 500 to 4,000 people were tested daily here in order to understand prevalence and incidence of the disease. We collected one wastewater sample every day. And not to say that the metrics were equivalent, but that wastewater sample also gave us an indication of whether, there was spread transmissibility within the province. So cost effectiveness, the economic aspect is a benefit of wastewater surveillance.
All right. Gustavo, how about using wastewater? I mean, obviously, for many people, this is the first time we're hearing about it as an option for studying the state of affairs related to COVID-19. Has it been used in the past with previous viruses?
Well, yes, it was used very successfully with polio in the 60s and the 70s. It was, in different countries, it has been used, extensively before. And one of the reasons, because it was particularly ready to be used with this COVID-19, is because these previous experiences.
Previous experiences that you say go back as much as 50 years? Is that right? Did I hear right?
Yes.
Huh, okay. So Claire, when we had, for example, SARS, which was, I guess, back in 2003, do you know whether there was any investigation of wastewater there to see how prevalent it was in the population?
Yes, I believe there was.
There was?
Yeah, there was a collaboration between universities and the city to look for SARS in wastewater.
What more do you need, Claire, in order to I guess, build up some real, not expertise, no, testing infrastructure, I guess is what I'm looking for, because obviously we've got SARS today, but I think we all know now that this is not going to be the last pandemic that we deal with in our lifetime. So what does the future look like?
Yeah, so I mean, right now, the Provincial Wastewater Surveillance Initiative, it's mainly university labs across the province are doing the analysis. And, my understanding is that there's interest in integrating private laboratories into the program. And this is really to allow the research labs to pivot back to research. And there's a lot of interest in doing research on surveillance development. So this is something I think that would be, smart for the province to do, is just to bring in more capacity for this type of analysis. I think there's actually even examples internationally of municipalities who've integrated the wastewater testing for SARS-CoV-2 into their compliance sampling. So the municipalities actually develop in-house expertise to do this. So that's maybe something that could be considered. And yeah, I think beyond future pandemics, I think there's even interest in using wastewater surveillance to track more common diseases like influenza, where we don't have great clinical data.
Robert, what would you like to see happen?
Yeah, just picking up on that exactly. So, like now that we built a lot of knowledge throughout the pandemic. So if you're looking at a pandemic and say there can be some silver linings, knowledge accumulation and building of that knowledge maybe is one of them. And in the wastewater surveillance field, that knowledge really was built throughout the pandemic, and now expanding that and everything we learned into, like Claire was saying, into influenza, into respiratory viruses, into other sort of disease targets. Also, we've seen through this initiative here in Ontario, and Gustavo, is working in the north, but even in terms of remote communities and Indigenous communities, we've seen the benefits of this technology. So there's a lot of potential here, and there's a lot of infrastructure that's been built up through this initiative, and hopefully we could keep going with it.
We've got about a minute and a half to go here, and Claire, I'm going to ask you a bit of a quirky question here, which is, why does someone want to go into this line of work?
Well, I mean, I can only share my own experience. I'm a hydrologist by training. I don't study wastewater. And this was just started as a side project. A group of researchers at the Urban Water Research Center at Ryerson got into, and it just it ballooned from there. And it's actually kind of interesting once you start learning about wastewater systems and sewers. It's you find out they're pretty fascinating. It's a secret kind of hidden world that a lot of us don't know about, but I think it can provide us a lot of information if we pay attention to it.
Clearly. Okay, in my last 30 seconds, Gustavo, I'm going to ask you a quirky question, and that is, I want to ask you about your wife. Who was your wife's grandfather?
Oh, Charles Best, as many of you know, he was part of the discovery of the insulin.
Everybody knows Banting and Best, and your wife's grandfather was Charlie Best. How about that?
Yeah.
2 degrees of separation from scientific magnificence. There you go. I just wanted to get that on the record as well. Very good. Claire, Gustavo, Robert, great of all three of you to join us here on TVO tonight. We're grateful for your time.
Thank you
very much.
Thanks so much.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.